Hi there again, and welcome to another series of Bookmark. Tonight we look at a book called Riders on the Storm, The Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being. And here it is held up just for you to view what it is. It's by Alastair McIntosh, who's Scottish. It was published last year, 2020, by Berlin in the UK. It's roughly 200 pages plus endnotes, and it costs £9.99. And on the front cover it says, a quote from the BBC TV, one of the world's leading environmental campaigners. So it's Alastair McIntosh, Riders on the Storm. Let me just read actually a little bit about who Alastair McIntosh is to give you an indication. And I quote from inside. Alastair McIntosh is an independent writer, broadcaster, activist and honorary professor at Glasgow University. A human ecologist, he speaks widely on the challenging questions of our time, including climate change, globalization, land reform, community empowerment, and non-violence, with an emphasis on psychological and spiritual depth. So he's brought together lots of different subject matters. He's also got a PhD in theology. But he's written other books that are well known: Soil and Soul, People versus Corporate Power, and Poacher's Pilgrimage, an island journey round his homeland in the Outer Hebrides. On the back, I'll give you a flavour of what this book is about, Riders on the Storm. It says this: climate change is the greatest challenge to humankind today. While the coronavirus sheds a light on the vulnerability of our interconnected world, the effects of global warming will be permanent, indeed catastrophic, without a massive shift in human behaviour. Writer, scholar and broadcaster Alastair McIntosh sums up the present knowledge and shows that conventional solutions are not enough. In rejecting the blind alleys of climate change denial, exaggeration and false optimism, he offers a scintillating discussion of ways forward. Weaving together science, politics, psychology, and spirituality, this guide examines what it takes to make us riders on the storm. And you may well recognise Riders on the Storm as that famous track by The Doors, late 60s, which talks about the home in which we're born into, this world, but also that much falls to us to try and rectify and improve a world that finds itself in a lot of trouble. So having given you a little flavour of who he is and what the book is about, I'm going to walk you through the 9 chapters. There's an introduction which is about less than 3 pages, and then walk you briefly through the 9 chapters to indicate and give an overview of what the book is about. And I highly recommend it. It's probably one of the best books to give a good sense of orientation in the midst of climate change and all that is likely to bring. And it's now beyond denial unless you're part of that very small cohort who probably denies reality, so to speak. He brings together soil, that's land, soul, which is the kind of spiritual, psychological element of life, and society, which is how we interact with each other and try to solve our common problems and dilemmas, and also take the good on board and try to enhance it even further. So in an introductory, in the first chapter called A Walk Along the Shore, he reminisces about 2 years ago being back in his home island of Lewis, which is the northernmost of the Outer Hebrides Islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. And he and his wife and a group of locals are meeting with a group of people from Papua New Guinea and West New Guinea. These folk he had known, or some of their friends and colleagues from the past, because McIntosh had actually worked overseas some years ago on an engineering project for several years with VSO, the Voluntary Service Overseas. So he has kept those ties, and he was trying to find commonalities between the very different region and climate of people in Papua New Guinea and the people in the Outer Isles of Scotland. There are lots of differences, but quite a few commonalities, because both those island peoples are being threatened. Their land and their homeland is being eroded by the forces of nature. And so they had a shared exchange visit each way. And then, having sort of explored that a little bit autobiographically about his homeland and how it's dear to him, but under a sense of threat, he begins to take us through the kind of big players in the climate change challenge. McIntosh and his wife actually live in Govan in Glasgow, almost a stone's throw from where COP26 will take place in Glasgow this coming November 2021. You realise that was postponed for a year because of the coronavirus. And this is the follow-up to the Paris Climate Accord that took place in 2015. This is called COP26 because it's the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP, Conference of the Parties. And the parties are the almost 200 nations which have signed up to the UN's framework of Convention on Climate Change. So it's nearly all the recognised countries of the world have signed up to this. There's been controversy about the United States coming out under Trump's time, but now with Biden, they're back in. And COP26 brings together the leading scientists and all those other interested parties, politicians, economists, and other influencers. And they meet in recognition of a group called the IPCC. The IPCC, there are quite a few acronyms in the book, but they're inescapable, but they are explained by McIntosh. The IPCC means the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that was set up in 1998 by the United Nations, who are, in a sense, hosting and organising COP26 in Glasgow soon to come. Now, this gets us into the realm of contested science. There are some people who still contest, but their influence is waning. But they've done an awful lot to block what should have been done over the last several decades. Nonetheless, the game is changing, and it's changing in the right direction. But the trouble is we have wasted so much time and done so much harm. McIntosh does an excellent job in the next three chapters, 2, 3, and 4, to explain and unpick for the rest of us who are not specialist scientists what it means to kind of understand the basic common sense science that prevails in the IPCC. Now, the IPCC does not do its own research. What it does is to cast an umbrella and collate all the leading scientific research, papers, documents, all of it peer-reviewed, and there's a sifting process where the leading several hundred scientists in the world, coming from their different specialisms, all come together and recognise each other's contributions, which is how science and academia and good governance works and should work. So any people who are skeptical of that are really undermining any hope to have any plausible, shareable human knowledge. And if that's the case, those folk basically belong in the camp of the cranks and QAnon and people who are just way beyond what are seen to be respectable, responsible, scientific and other forms of knowledge. So along with McIntosh, I stake my claim, the little that I know, on the experts who sieve through this and do it responsibly and do it well. In the next, so these three chapters are the heart of the science, and the first chapter, or chapter 2, is called Impacts on the World of Ice and Oceans. And it owes all its scientific research to a body called CROCC. It's the Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. Cryosphere is basically the ice, the polar caps, Antarctic and Antarctica. And in these reports that come from the various bodies, they use calibrated language that tries to describe levels of confidence, levels of agreement, and levels of likelihood that something will happen or not. So you're talking about a high or a low level of confidence, a good degree of agreement or a low degree of agreement, and a high or a low or a medium degree of likelihood that something will happen. So it's very carefully calibrated. So it's not alarmism, it's not outlandish, it's sober, it's scientific, and it's peer reviewed. So this is the best of the best, and this is what it's incumbent upon us to have confidence in. These three chapters, in a sense, McIntosh acknowledges are a bit dry, or the documents behind them are dry, but to save us all the hard work of sifting through it all, he's done it for us, and he summarizes it extremely well. So that chapter is about the impacts on ice and oceans. The next chapter is called Climate Change on Land and Human Life, and it depends on a report from a body called SRCCL, Special Report on Climate Change and Land, about populations growing, about land being burnt, about too much farming, a lot of deforestation, about the fact that that water and other resources are being depleted. All of those things come together on climate change and land. And then the fourth chapter and the third and final one about the science, the raw science, is containing global warming to within 1.5 degrees C. And this depends on a report called SR 1.5. In other words, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And the reason why 1.5 degrees is so vitally important is that scientists have recognized that if we can keep global warming, which has already increased about 1 degree in the last 100 years or so, if we can keep it to increasing no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, then we will probably end up with some unfortunate changes, but still those that are manageable and tolerable, and we can adapt to them. Once we encroach and go above 1.5, and the scenarios of 2 and 3 and 4 and even up to 6, each seeming to us very small, minuscule change or increase in temperature, global temperature, overall temperature, will have increasingly dire consequences, and that will be very serious for us all in times to come. Now, there are two words that are extremely important here, and I'm trying to find where I've made my notes. Yeah, it's on mitigation and adaptation, and I'll quote very briefly from page 19 of the book because these two words are very important. McIntosh writes, mitigation means action, climate action that can be taken to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. Because of fossil fuels being used in greenhouse gas emissions, we're heating up the planet with all those interactions that are serious and dangerous. Mitigation means what we can do to reduce that. However, if that doesn't happen or happen as well as it should, there is also adaptation. And adaptation means action that can be taken to live with the consequences of mitigation failure. So better to mitigate now and do what we can to reduce the impacts. But if we don't mitigate as well as we might or could or should, then adaptation follows. And adaptation is, in a sense, trying to adapt and change to things that are going from medium to poor to worse. It's a bit like prevention is better than cure. So let's make sure we prevent as best possible. Let's mitigate so that we don't have to do as much and as serious and dire adaptation. So those three chapters dwell on the science. They're dry, although he writes about them very well and clearly. I don't think you can find someone who does that job better, but it helps us trawling through documents that would be probably overwhelming for most lay folk, us. Then there follows a chapter called Skeptics and the Psychology of Denial, a really good chapter where he talks about the vested interests of those economists and politicians and movers and shakers who have been very loath because they have benefited from the capitalist system to have very much change. The status quo suits people who are wealthy and rich and influential and in power. They have had lots of vested interests that they have protected. They've wielded great power, had great influence, continue to do so, and they have been significant, if not major, blockers to any of the creative necessary changes that we all need to enact, and as soon as possible. So, skeptics and the psychology and the practices of denial have been, in a sense, enemies of the good and the common good. His next chapter, chapter 6, is called Rebellion and Leadership in Climate Movements. This is about Extinction Rebellion and all the other movements and organisations. Now, McIntosh has got a latent sympathy with their cause, and he thinks that in many ways what they hope for and aim for and care about is largely right. And he's got many friends who work in those agencies. Indeed, he has been part of them over the years. But, and whilst they represent a less grave threat than the denialists do, who have been and continue to be in charge, so to speak, he offers a very penetrating critique of his friends and colleagues in that he speaks about the danger of a mentality and of the tactics, some of the tactics that can become alarmist, that can sometimes undermine and, in a way, erode the goodwill of the populace at large, who may be sympathetic in many ways to climate change being addressed. But if the tactics of the Extinction Rebellion and other alarmists and people who are maybe too alarmist about it, some of those tactics and strategies are in a sense undermine their own decent cause. So those two chapters, looking at the different ends of the spectrum, are extremely good. The next chapter, chapter 7, is called To Regenerate the Earth. And this is where he looks at some of the practical policies and projects and solutions, possible solutions, that will help to mitigate the worst of climate change and its consequences. And he's very good at analysing. He's been involved in many of these things, so he's got his finger on the pulse. He's a very practical person. So he speaks well of the possible solutions. Now, he would say that we are foolish if we think that the scientists and the technologists and future inventions are going to come to the rescue, a bit like Superman or whatever. It ain't going to happen. There are things that can be done, many things that can be done, but it's multiple things working gradually and working radically that will work and mitigate the worst. But if we think that there's a snap solution, well, it's not going to happen. That's just too outlandish and it's too idealistic. But he's really good at giving you an idea of how the likely solutions will work. The next chapter, chapter 8, is about the survival of being. And this is the one where he weaves together spirituality, theology, philosophy, psychology. He does that wonderfully well, because this is not just about practical challenges, real and urgent as they are. It's about how we as human beings live and can revise our practices, indeed our whole ways of being, our way of life. And if we go on as we are, things will get worse, and they will get worse quicker, and the outcomes and the consequences will be worse for us, but more likely for the next coming generations. And if we have left them a legacy of destruction and all of that, how will that reflect on us? And how may we even be judged by God? Those are deep questions, but they're treated extremely well by McIntosh in the book. And then the last chapter, called The Rainmakers, where he talks about the fact that it depends on us, the coming storm and the rain and the wind and that kind of metaphor. But his final conclusion is that we oughtn't to panic, and we ought not just to bury our head in the sand. His plea is for us to be more humane with and for each other, and more loving of the earth and the environment. And his final word, which he repeats several times, is a life of compassion. So this is a book that's sober, it's scientific, it explains things very well, but it brings the head and the heart and the science and all of that together, and it's a deeply humane and sane book. And his plea is for more compassion. It's realistic rather than optimistic or idealistic. He pitches it well. He's written other books which I referenced: Sword and Soul, Poacher's Pilgrimage, Hell and High Water, all on related themes, but I think this is probably the one he brings it all together best, in Riders on the Storm. And let me briefly end by speaking about 3 other books or authors on similar theme which pitch things at a different level. You've got, and this is chronologically, you've got Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, Capitalism and Climate. Quite provocative, wonderfully well written, and well worth a read. Then chronologically next, The Uninhabited Earth, a story of the future, David Wallace Wells, an American. That's probably the most alarmist and the most doomful of the 3 books. Be prepared for quite a shock when you read it, but it's worth a read. And then this one called The Future We Choose, and it is by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivet-Carnat, who were involved through the UN at the Paris Climate Agreement of several years back. The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. And that again has got realism and hope about it, pretty much in keeping with McIntosh. So I've spoken a wee bit longer than I meant to tonight, but it's maybe a sense of how good the book is and how urgent is the issue that will no longer go away. We are in the thick of it, and we must respond faithfully and responsibly, and the church and Christians no less. Riders on the Storm, The Climate Crisis, and The Survival of Being by Alastair McIntosh. Thanks for tuning in. We'll look at another book of a different type next week. In the meantime, God bless, and thanks for listening.